72 hours after the Reykjavik resolution collapsed, the North Atlantic no longer felt like an alliance zone. It felt like a fault line. Officially, nothing had broken. Flags still flew together outside headquarters in Brussels. Liaison officers still occupied their offices in Norfolk, Ramstein, and Naples. Secure lines were still open. But trust, the invisible architecture of NATO, had already failed. The trigger was not a missile, nor a ship, nor a shot fired in anger. It was a vote. At 2:14 Central European Time, the European Security Council ratified Emergency Directive 19B, invoking Article 4 without American concurrence for the first time in the alliance's history. The language was deliberately sterile. Strategic autonomy in response to unilateral destabilizing actions by a member state. No country was named. No accusations were spoken aloud. Everyone knew who it meant. Washington learned of the decision from an encrypted media leak before the official diplomatic channel delivered the notice. By dawn, U.S. European Command had elevated its internal readiness posture from Amber to Crimson Watch, a classification that did not technically violate any treaty, but had not been used since the final days of the Cold War. Satellite tasking schedules were rewritten. Reconnaissance drones already in the air were ordered to remain on station, but to operate under passive sensors only. No one wanted to be the first to blink. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, General Henri Delacroix read the briefing twice before signing the operational annex. The directive authorized NATO naval units to conduct independent maritime security operations in the North Atlantic and Baltic Sea regions, without coordination with U.S. command structures. In plain terms, it meant separation. By 1800 hours local time, standing NATO Maritime Group 1 had altered course. The frigates FS Aquitaine, FGS Saxon, and ITS Carlo Bergamini turned northwest, establishing a patrol arc that deliberately intersected traditional U.S. Navy transit lanes. The move was described publicly as routine. Privately, every captain understood the implication. Overlapping patrols without shared command meant friction. Friction meant risk. On board the USS Paul Ignatius, operating 140 nautical miles south of Iceland, Captain Daniel Hargreave received the update via a secure burst transmission. The message contained no orders to withdraw, no change to rules of engagement, just a single appended line from Fleet Command. Assume contested coordination. Record everything. The ocean was calm that night. Too calm. Radar contacts painted clean lines across the screens, each echo steady and predictable. Hargreave trusted neither. History had taught him that war never began with chaos. It began with clarity that felt wrong. At 2341 Zulu, the Ignatius detected a NATO drone, a Eurohawk variant, operating inside what the U.S. Navy still classified as a shared patrol envelope. Its transponder was active but encrypted under a European-only cipher. The drone did not respond to hails. For 6 minutes, nothing happened. Then the drone adjusted course, descending slightly, its sensor array pivoting toward the American destroyer. The maneuver was legal. Aggressive, but legal. Still, the fire control officer felt his jaw tighten. Sensor focus was intimacy in modern warfare. It meant attention. Attention meant intent. Hargreave ordered passive countermeasures only. No locks. No illumination. In Brussels, analysts watched the encounter unfold in silence, streams of telemetry flickering across darkened rooms. No one spoke the word provocation, but it hovered in the air like static. At 0:03, the drone suffered a sudden guidance failure. It pitched violently, clipped the ocean surface, and disintegrated in a spray of foam and debris. No weapons had been fired. Within 12 minutes, NATO released a statement accusing U.S. electronic warfare interference of causing the crash. Washington denied involvement, citing system logs and electromagnetic records. Both were technically correct. The interference had not come from the Ignatius. It had come from a third platform, an automated signal management buoy deployed months earlier under a joint program that no longer had a joint command. The machinery of cooperation, abandoned but still active, had acted on outdated parameters. By morning, markets reacted faster than diplomats. The euro fell sharply. Defense stocks surged on both sides of the Atlantic. Social media filled with maps, speculation, and the first whispered phrase that governments avoided: alliance fracture. At 9:30 Eastern Standard Time, the President of the United States convened the National Security Council. The meeting lasted 4 hours and produced no public declaration. Internally, however, the tone shifted. Contingency plans once labeled unthinkable were reclassified as prudent. One briefing slide carried a stark title. Scenario: NATO force misalignment, hostile contact probability 62%. In Ramstein Air Base, German Eurofighter squadrons were placed on extended readiness. The order emphasized restraint, but pilots were issued live loadouts instead of training configurations. In Italy, naval bases quietly restricted American access, pending administrative clarification. The clarification never came. On the afternoon of Day 3, a U.S. Air Force RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft entered international airspace over the Norwegian Sea. Its mission profile was standard, unchanged for decades. This time, 2 NATO fighters intercepted it. The approach was professional. Textbook. No flares. No locks. But the distance closed to 20 meters. Close enough to see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. Close enough to misunderstand a movement. At 14:17 Zulu, an automatic defensive system aboard the RC-135 registered a threat profile and released countermeasures. Chaff bloomed in the sky like metallic snow. One of the intercepting fighters rolled hard to avoid debris. The maneuver overstressed the airframe. The jet spiraled downward, vanishing into the gray water below. No mayday. No survivors. The silence afterward was total. By nightfall, both sides had sealed communications. Emergency hotlines remained technically open, but unanswered. The first Allied casualty of the conflict had fallen, not to enemy fire, but to protocol colliding with fear. Historians would later mark this moment as the true beginning, not because a plane was lost, but because restraint had failed, quietly, irreversibly, without anyone giving the order. By the 4th day, the lawyers had overtaken the generals. Every movement across the Atlantic was now accompanied by legal annotations, footnotes, and interpretive memos that attempted to define the undefinable. How 2 forces bound by the same treaty could maneuver against each other without technically becoming enemies. They failed. At 6 o'clock Zulu, Allied Maritime Command issued a clarification bulletin. It stated that NATO vessels retained the right to defensive exclusion maneuvers against any platform demonstrating persistent intelligence collection behavior detrimental to collective European security. The phrase was immediately challenged by Washington. The United States countered with its own notice, asserting that any attempt to interfere with U.S. naval freedom of navigation would be considered hostile obstruction, regardless of alliance status. Between those 2 definitions lay the ocean. In the Baltic Sea, the situation deteriorated fastest. Geography allowed no space for ambiguity. Narrow shipping lanes, overlapping radar coverage, centuries of historical tension compressed into a few hundred nautical miles. Standing NATO Group 2 established a layered patrol east of Bornholm. Their stated mission: maritime stability. Their unstated one: deny American submarines uncontested access to the region. At 11:22 local time, the Danish frigate HDMS Niels Jewel detected an acoustic anomaly beneath the thermocline. The signature matched a Virginia-class submarine with high probability. Protocol required notification. Instead, the contact was logged as unidentified submerged object. Within minutes, passive sonar buoys were deployed. Not weapons, just sensors. The submarine, USS Illinois, detected the pattern immediately. Its commander, Captain Rebecca Sloan, recognized the geometry for what it was: a soft box. Not an attack, but a trap designed to force maneuvering. She ordered depth change and silent running. The NATO frigates adjusted in response. Above the water, nothing appeared to happen. Below it, 2 command philosophies collided, one trained to dominate, the other to deny. At 12:04, a Norwegian P-8 patrol aircraft entered the area, dropping additional sonobuoys. One drifted too close. Its active ping struck the submarine's hull like a hammer. Sloan interpreted it as escalation. She was wrong, but interpretation mattered more than intent. The Illinois released a single acoustic countermeasure and executed an emergency lateral maneuver. In doing so, it crossed directly beneath the Niels Jewel at unsafe proximity. The frigate's sonar array overloaded, feeding garbage data into the combat system. For 14 seconds, the Danish ship believed it was under torpedo attack, its automated defense system armed. Only the manual intervention of the weapons officer prevented a launch. When the incident report reached Copenhagen, the word near catastrophic appeared in bold. By evening, the Baltic was declared a restricted stability zone by NATO command. U.S. vessels were advised, not ordered, to avoid the area. The advice was ignored. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic proper, a more visible confrontation unfolded. Carrier Strike Group 12, centered on the USS Harry S. Truman, was conducting what Washington described as a routine transatlantic repositioning. NATO observers described it as force signaling. They were both correct. At 1930 Zulu, French and Spanish naval units began parallel shadowing maneuvers at a distance of 40 nautical miles. Drones filled the sky, their contrails weaving invisible lines of attention between fleets. No one locked weapons. Everyone locked sensors. On the Truman, Captain Elias Moreno convened his senior staff. The rules of engagement had been updated twice in 12 hours. Each revision added restrictions, exceptions, and conditional clauses. The final sentence was the clearest. Commanders retain inherent right of self-defense. That right was about to be tested. At 21:11, the NATO frigate FS Province activated a fire control radar for 3.6 seconds. The official explanation would later cite a calibration error. The Truman's combat system did not care about explanations. Alarms sounded across the carrier. Defensive aircraft were launched immediately. F divided by a -18s roared into the night, not armed for strike, but for interception. Their pilots had trained for this scenario only in theory. At 21:24, the opposing formations met at altitude. Radio contact was attempted on 3 frequencies. None connected. Encryption keys no longer matched. Visual signals replaced words. Wings rocked. Flares burned briefly, then faded. For 8 minutes, the pilots flew mirrored patterns, each move interpreted through layers of suspicion. No one wanted to fire. No one wanted to withdraw. Then a drone, autonomous, algorithm-driven, misclassified a maneuver. It dove. The NATO formation reacted instantly. Defensive flares erupted. One American pilot mistook the flash for a missile launch and triggered a reflexive response. A single AIM-9X left the rail. The missile struck the drone, not a manned aircraft. The explosion lit the clouds orange. Technically, no one had been attacked. Psychologically, the threshold was crossed. Within an hour, both sides issued statements accusing the other of reckless escalation while reaffirming commitment to peace. The contradiction was not lost on anyone. At 3 o'clock Washington time, the president authorized Operation Iron Ledger, a contingency plan designed to secure American assets in Europe in the event of alliance degradation. The wording avoided a single forbidden phrase. In Brussels, NATO command initiated counterbalance protocol, dispersing European air assets and hardening bases against possible preemptive strikes. Missile defense systems came online across Germany, Poland, and Italy. Civilians noticed. Flights were canceled. Ports slowed. Energy prices spiked again. The illusion of normalcy fractured. The first protest erupted in Amsterdam. The first riot followed in Marseille. The slogans varied, but the fear was the same. Who was the enemy if the alliance itself was splitting? On the 6th day, the answer arrived at sea. At 4:47 Zulu, the American logistics vessel USNS Mendonça was transiting west of Ireland under civilian markings. Its cargo was classified. Its escort minimal. A NATO maritime patrol aircraft identified it as a potential dual-use military transport. Orders were requested. They did not arrive in time. The aircraft dropped a marker buoy, a signal to redirect course. The Mendonça did not alter heading. At 5:02, a warning shot was fired across its bow by the Spanish frigate Blas de Lezo. The round struck the water harmlessly. On the Mendonça, the impact sensor logged hostile fire. An automated distress signal was transmitted. That signal changed everything. Within minutes, U.S. naval escorts accelerated toward the contact point. NATO units did the same. The convergence was unavoidable. By sunrise, 2 Allied fleets faced each other at missile range. No one had declared war, but the sea no longer recognized the difference. Sunrise over the North Atlantic revealed a geometry no treaty had prepared for. 8 surface combatants from 6 NATO states faced a U.S. escort group at a distance of 62 nautical miles. The separation was deliberate, just outside immediate engagement range, close enough that every radar sweep felt like a hand on a trigger. Between them drifted the USNS Mendoza, engines idling, civilian hull markings still intact. A ship that, 12 hours earlier, no one outside Logistics Command had known existed was now the most dangerous object in the ocean. At 6:18 Zulu, NATO Command transmitted a joint communique demanding inspection rights under emergency collective security provisions. The message was precise, legalistic, and impossible to accept without precedent. The U.S. response was shorter. Denied. Vessel operating under sovereign protection. Interference will be interpreted as hostile action. The word hostile echoed across both command chains like a dropped glass. In Brussels, deliberation fractured. Southern commands urged de-escalation. Eastern members demanded resolve. Northern fleets waited, fuel burning, crews silent at their stations. No single commander held authority to disengage everyone. That was the flaw. At 6:41, a Polish missile corvette on NATO's eastern flank reported a radar anomaly, fast, low, approaching from the west. The contact was misclassified as a U.S. anti-ship missile. In reality, it was an American EA-18G Growler conducting electronic suppression, its signature distorted by layered jamming already saturating the battle space. The corvette's combat system flagged imminent threat. The decision window lasted 4.7 seconds. A single RBS-15 missile launched. Its target was not the Growler. It was the destroyer USS Arleigh Burke, screening the Mendoza from the north. The missile struck amidships at 6:44. The explosion tore through 2 compartments, igniting fuel lines and collapsing internal bulkheads. The Burke listed sharply, smoke pouring from its superstructure. Damage control teams responded instantly, but the hit had been catastrophic. 23 sailors were killed in the first minute. The Atlantic froze. For 11 seconds, no one fired back. Those 11 seconds would later be studied frame by frame in war colleges. Then the U.S. Aegis cruiser USS Leyte Gulf registered the launch vector, confirmed hostile origin, and executed autonomous retaliation under standing self-defense protocols. 2 SM-6 missiles left their tubes. They struck the Polish corvette almost simultaneously. The ship broke apart, its stern lifting briefly before sliding beneath the surface. Of its crew of 96, only 14 were recovered. The alliance had crossed the line it no longer controlled. Emergency channels erupted. Orders overlapped. Counterorders followed. NATO command attempted to impose a ceasefire bubble, but the fleets were now operating on combat logic, not political intent. Within minutes, the engagement spread. A German frigate fired warning shots toward an approaching U.S. destroyer. An Italian vessel launched decoys in response to perceived targeting. American aircraft locked radars defensively. NATO air patrols mirrored the move. The sky filled with signals screaming threat without context. At 7:12, a Norwegian missile battery on the Fridtjof Nansen misinterpreted a radar reflection from burning debris as an incoming strike. Its commander hesitated, then authorized launch. The missile missed its intended target. It did not miss the sea lane. The explosion disabled a U.S. supply ship operating 30 miles south, killing its engine room crew and leaving it adrift. By mid-morning, 3 ships were burning, 2 were sinking, and neither side could credibly claim control of escalation. The political response lagged behind the kinetic one. In Washington, the president addressed the nation from the Situation Room, not the Oval Office. His statement avoided naming NATO directly, referring instead to elements within Allied command structures acting beyond mandate. The message was meant to divide. In Brussels, NATO's Secretary General spoke of regrettable incidents resulting from unilateral American provocation. Both statements were immediately contradicted by satellite imagery flooding the public domain. The war was no longer abstract. At 12:30 Central European Time, the first cyberstrike hit. European power grid management systems experienced cascading failures across northern France and western Germany. Trains halted. Hospitals switched to backup generators. Air traffic control reverted to procedural separation. The attack bore all the hallmarks of U.S. Cyber Command doctrine. Washington denied responsibility. Simultaneously, American financial clearinghouses reported anomalies traced to servers routed through Baltic infrastructure. Trading was suspended. Insurance markets collapsed within minutes. Retaliation no longer required permission. That afternoon, NATO invoked a revised internal interpretation of Article 5, not against the United States as a whole, but against armed forces engaging in sustained hostile actions against member states. It was a legal fiction. It was enough. At 1800 hours Zulu, NATO air forces initiated Operation Continental Shield. Its objectives were limited on paper: deny U.S. air superiority over Europe, secure key logistics hubs, protect civilian infrastructure. The first wave targeted no cities. It targeted runways. Precision strikes cratered U.S.-controlled sections of Ramstein, Aviano, and Lakenheath. No nuclear weapons. No mass casualties. Just concrete, fuel, and aircraft caught in the open. The U.S. response came 3 hours later. Stealth bombers launched from beyond European radar coverage released conventional munitions against NATO command and control nodes in Belgium and the Netherlands. Communications fractured. Regional commanders lost contact with Brussels for nearly 40 minutes. During that blackout, local decisions multiplied. Some units stood down. Others advanced. In the confusion, a U.S. Patriot battery in eastern Poland mistook a NATO aircraft for a hostile intruder and fired. The jet went down over farmland. Civilians watched the wreckage burn. The war had reached land. By nightfall, casualty estimates exceeded 1,800 across all forces. No single battle accounted for most of them. It was the accumulation, friction everywhere, restraint nowhere. Diplomats worked frantically through neutral capitals: Switzerland, Turkey, India, any channel that still functioned. But military momentum outpaced diplomacy. At 2 o'clock on the 10th day, U.S. Strategic Command elevated readiness to DEFCON 3. NATO followed within the hour. Nuclear forces were not being prepared for use. They were being prepared to be seen. Satellites moved. Submarines repositioned. Missile crews received sealed envelopes they did not open. The message to the world was clear. This was no longer a crisis. It was a war no one had planned, and no one now knew how to stop. By the 11th day, the war had outrun language. Words like alliance, partner, collective security still appeared in official statements, but they no longer described reality. They were artifacts, remnants of a structure that had collapsed while everyone was still standing inside it. Across the North Atlantic, sonar nets tightened. In the Mediterranean, carrier groups maneuvered without acknowledging each other's existence. Over Europe, the air was crowded with aircraft flying patterns designed not to attack, but to be seen. Visibility had become deterrence. At 4:40 Zulu, U.S. Strategic Command confirmed what analysts had quietly expected. At least 4 NATO member states had transitioned portions of their nuclear forces from peacetime custody to enhanced readiness. The weapons remained unfueled. Warheads stayed separated. But procedures changed. The United States responded in kind. Ohio-class submarines adjusted patrol boxes. Bomber crews were placed on strip alert. Missile fields across the Midwest rotated personnel under live authentication protocols. None of it was announced. Everyone knew anyway. Global markets did not wait for confirmation. Trading halted in Tokyo, Frankfurt, and New York within minutes of each other. Shipping insurers voided Atlantic routes. Civil aviation authorities closed airspace in overlapping rings across Europe and the eastern seaboard of the United States. The world economy entered cardiac arrest. On day 12, the first civilian mass casualty event occurred, not from a bomb, but from absence. A cyber-induced blackout in southern Italy disabled hospital life support systems for 6 minutes. Backup generators failed to synchronize. 47 patients died before power returned. No one claimed responsibility. No one needed to. That night, something unprecedented happened. At 22:17 Zulu, a secure backchannel opened between U.S. Northern Command and a provisional NATO crisis cell operating out of Geneva. The channel did not use diplomatic codes. It used deconfliction protocols originally designed for nuclear accident prevention. The message contained no demands. Only a question: are your systems still fully under human control? The reply came 12 minutes later. For now, that answer terrified both sides more than any missile launch. Autonomous defense algorithms, radar-cued interceptors, cyber countermeasures, automated escalation ladders. had been designed for speed, not wisdom. They assumed doctrine, hierarchy, alignment. They assumed an enemy. They had not been built for civil war. On day 13, an American early warning satellite experienced a sensor anomaly over the Arctic. For 90 seconds, it reported a pattern consistent with multiple ballistic missile launches from northern Europe. The alert propagated instantly. Strategic Command had 6 minutes to decide whether the signal was real. They did nothing. It was the hardest order given in the war. NATO Command detected the same anomaly from a different angle. Their systems, too, flagged launch indicators. Their response mirrored Washington's, not because of coordination, but because of paralysis. Human judgment had re-entered the loop. The anomaly resolved itself. Ice reflections, solar interference, a known failure mode, documented, ignored, rediscovered. The world exhaled. For the first time since the conflict began, escalation had been consciously rejected. That moment became the hinge. Behind closed doors, both sides acknowledged the same truth. Victory was undefined, unattainable, and potentially meaningless. There were no territorial objectives left. No ideological gains to be made that justified extinction-level risk. What remained was damage control. On day 15, hostilities slowed, not stopped, but dampened. Air patrols widened their separation. Naval groups adjusted courses to avoid convergence. Cyber operations shifted from disruption to observation. The guns did not fall silent, but they paused. At 3 o'clock Zulu on day 17, a joint communiqué was released simultaneously from Washington and Geneva. It did not declare peace. It did not admit fault. It announced a temporary operational suspension of contested force postures pending structural reassessment of alliance frameworks. The phrase was meaningless to civilians. To militaries, it meant stand down without retreat. By the end of the month, casualties were estimated at over 14,000 military personnel and an unknown number of civilians affected indirectly by infrastructure collapse. No capital cities lay in ruins. No nuclear weapons had detonated. And yet, the world had changed more profoundly than if they had. NATO still existed, on paper. So did the transatlantic partnership. But something irreparable had been exposed. Deterrence worked only as long as everyone agreed who it was meant to deter. Historians would later call the conflict the Mutual Silence War, a war defined not by decisive battles, but by the constant, shared decision not to press the final button. There was no victory. There was no surrender. Only exhaustion, fear, and a permanent recalibration of what cooperation meant in an age where allies could become adversaries without ever declaring it. On the last operational day, a U.S. destroyer and a European frigate passed each other in the Atlantic at a distance of 5 nautical miles. Their radars were active. Their weapons were ready. No signals were exchanged. 2 ships, 2 flags, 1 silence. And beneath them, the ocean kept its secrets, indifferent, eternal, waiting for the next mistake.